The land of Canaan was a landscape of jagged, fractured stone, where over 30 independent city-states clawed at the dust, each ruled by a king who claimed absolute authority over his own small patch of territory. For generations, these rulers lived in a state of perpetual, low-level war, fighting over mountain springs and skirmishing over trade routes while obsessing over the border stones that defined their limited kingdoms. Because the history of the region was written in the blood of these endless, localized vendettas, every king functioned as a rival to his neighbor, and every city stood as a fortress built to withstand the envy of the kingdom down the road. There was no Canaanite identity, for there was only the city, the king, and the wall. Then a new force emerged from the eastern wilderness, cutting a decisive path toward the heart of the region and bypassing every traditional mountain pass. It was a mobile, disciplined, and relentless infantry that refused to play by the rules of territorial warfare. When news of the fall of Jericho and the destruction of Ai reached the royal courts, the atmosphere shifted from arrogance to a sickening, cold realization of vulnerability. As the buffer zones vanished and the standard tactics of siege and defense failed, they witnessed a military phenomenon that did not fight for land or tribute, but for the total displacement of the old order. This created a paradox that history rarely records. Sworn enemies who had spent lifetimes trying to eradicate one another suddenly sought a way to merge their resources against a common storm. The mystery is not how they fought, but why these proud men were willing to set aside decades of hatred to form a unified front against the approaching tribes of Israel. This brings us to a chilling realization. Their desperate quest for unity would become the very trap that ensured their total destruction. To understand why these sworn rivals suddenly chose unity as their final, desperate act, we have to step inside the very walls that once kept them safe from one another. The life of a Canaanite king was defined by the security of his stone fortifications, which were built with massive cyclopean stones and arranged in thick, imposing walls designed to withstand any conventional assault known to the ancient world. Inside these walls, the king exercised the power of a Lugal, a term meaning a big man or a local potentate. Yet while his authority was absolute, it was also entirely local. He did not care about what happened 10 miles down the road unless it threatened his own supply of grain or his control over a trade road. The Canaanite approach to warfare was equally narrow, manifesting as a system of ceremonial skirmishes where elite chariot corps would maneuver in open fields, and peasant militias would be called up to defend the ramparts if an enemy got too close. It was a predictable, structured, and manageable way of doing battle that had sustained these dynasties for centuries. However, the arrival of the Israelite tribes shattered this predictable reality. As their forces moved with rapid precision across the rugged central ridges, ignoring the chariot roads of the valley floor to strike directly at the fortified heights, the kings realized they were facing a high-speed, high-density infantry force that bypassed the usual checkpoints and ignored the customary rituals of surrender. Because they were trapped in a paradigm of warfare that belonged to a world rapidly ceasing to exist, the Canaanite kings found themselves fighting a ghost that refused to be pinned down. Their traditional military hardware, like their heavy chariot units, was rendered useless on the rugged, uneven terrain where the Israelites preferred to engage. Rather than facing enemies who merely wanted to rob them, they were now facing a force that intended to replace them entirely. This shift forced them into a tactical corner, and as we will see, their next move was a gamble that defied every instinct of survival they had ever known. As their massive cyclopean walls transformed from symbols of dominance into literal tombs for their people, these kings realized that their only hope for survival was to abandon the localized ego of their city-states and forge a coalition born entirely of panic. If you are finding this hidden look at the mechanics of ancient power as revealing as we are, Consider subscribing to the channel to ensure you never miss these deeper dives into the reality of the biblical narrative. The decision to form a coalition was, in reality, a confession of bankruptcy. When King Jabin of Hazor sent out the call for a united front, he was essentially admitting that the old system of the independent city-state had failed, as he recognized that the buffer between his kingdom and the incoming Israelites had evaporated, leaving him exposed to the same total war reality that had already wiped out his neighbors. This was not an alliance of strength, but a covenant of fear. The call to arms rippled outward from Hazor, drawing scattered garrisons from the northern plains and the coastal hills into a singular, ill-fated convergence point in the north. Because the archaeological record of the era paints a picture of intense, mutual distrust that defined these royal households, we know these kings had spent decades sabotaging each other, poisoning each other's reputations, and encroaching on each other's borders. To suddenly merge their armies meant sharing intelligence, coordinating command structures, and trusting in the military competence of a rival who, only a few years prior, might have been their greatest enemy. The logistical nightmare of such a merger cannot be overstated, as each city-state possessed its own distinct pantheon of gods and its own unique military traditions. Trying to integrate these forces into a singular, cohesive command was a recipe for catastrophe. They had no shared language of maneuver, no unified communication system, and no history of working toward a common goal. They were forced to merge their diverse cultic practices and their deeply rooted rivalries into a single, improvised defensive formation, which caused massive internal friction that crippled their ability to respond to the rapid, fluid movements of the Israelite forces. The coalition was not a well-oiled machine, but a fractured, chaotic assembly of terrified men. Every king in the alliance was still looking over his shoulder at his supposed partner, wondering if his neighbor would betray him at the first sign of a better deal. By attempting to fight a high-tech, unified force with a mismatched, improvised, and deeply fearful militia, the failure of this coalition was baked into its very inception, as the internal sabotage that defined their past dictated their ultimate collapse on the battlefield. It was a desperate, last-minute grab at order in a world that had already lost its stability, a frantic thrashing of a dying civilization that refused to recognize that the era of the individual city-state had reached its end. Because this alliance was built on the brittle foundation of a shared, paralyzing fear rather than a cohesive vision, it was destined to shatter the moment it faced a force unified by something far more powerful than the instinct to survive. The collapse of the Canaanite coalition reveals a fundamental truth about human systems in the face of divine movement. While the kings of Canaan relied on their physical security, their massive walls, and their ancient, human-centric strategies, all of these failed because they were rooted in a denial of the reality of the Creator. Their panic was the result of a long-standing refusal to acknowledge that the land did not belong to them, but was part of a larger, divine narrative that was moving toward its climax. Remember the fragmented, warring state we described at the start. This coalition was the final, desperate attempt to reclaim that lost autonomy through a common enemy. The contrast between the two sides remains startlingly clear. While the Israelites were unified by their covenant with Yahweh, a bond that transcended territory, geography, and individual ambition, the Canaanites were held together by the glue of their own terror, which acted as a poison rather than a catalyst for success. One was a foundational identity, born of a relationship with the divine, while the other was a temporary, desperate reaction to a threat. The strategic collapse of the local kings was not merely a series of tactical blunders on the battlefield, but the unraveling of a way of life that had been fundamentally opposed to the sovereignty of the Creator for centuries. The arrival of Israel served as the catalyst that forced the Canaanites to face the reality of their situation. When the coalition finally met the Israelites, they were not just fighting a human army, but were colliding with the unstoppable momentum of a timeline that had been set in motion long before the first stone was laid for their walls. Their refusal to yield to that sovereignty led to their complete and utter isolation, leaving them to rely on their own broken systems, their own distrustful allies, and their own crumbling infrastructure. The deadly mistake was thinking that a collection of frightened, warring men could outmaneuver or overpower a force backed by the very one who determined the rise and fall of nations. They stood behind their stone walls, waiting for a victory that was never going to come, because they had built their hopes on the shifting sands of human power rather than the bedrock of truth. The tragedy of the Canaanite kings is that they saw the writing on the wall, yet they chose to double down on the very systems that were destined to fail. Their story serves as an ancient warning that the ultimate security of any civilization is not found in its defenses, its leaders, or its coalitions, but in its recognition of the sovereignty that determines its fate. When the dust finally settled on the ruins of their great Cyclopean cities, all that remained of their desperate attempts to stop the inevitable was the silent evidence of a total strategic collapse. Their story is a permanent part of the historical record, a testament to the fact that when human pride stands against the tide of divine history, the result is always, inevitably, ruin. The broken coalitions of Canaan are a reminder that the world is governed by laws far higher than the strategies of kings or the strength of stone walls. We look back at these ruins and we see the outcome of their final choice, a choice that led them to ignore the reality of what was happening in their own land. The deadly mistake was not that they lost the war, but that they failed to realize their entire way of life was fundamentally incompatible with the truth that had arrived at their gates. They were blind to the shift in the balance of power because they were too invested in the illusion of their own control. And in that failure of vision, they paved the way for their own extinction. History has preserved the memory of their pride, their fear, and their ultimate inevitable defeat, all of which stands as a silent witness to the futility of human systems when they set themselves against the unstoppable reality of the divine. Their downfall was not a mystery, but a consequence. Their coalition was not a tactical solution, but a symptom of their spiritual bankruptcy. When we look at the ruins of Canaan, we are looking at the remnants of men who chose their own path instead of the path laid out for them, a path that led to their total and complete collapse. The lesson remains clear, and it is a lesson that echoes down through the ages, revealing the folly of those who think they can build a wall high enough or a coalition strong enough to block out the presence of the one who holds the keys to all history. Their deadly mistake remains the most significant and most repeated error in the annals of the ancient world. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were in the position of these ancient kings, what evidence of divine sovereignty would have been enough to make you stop fighting? As the dust settles on this final analysis, one truth stands absolute. Human empires rise and fall like grass, but the sovereignty of the Creator remains the only true foundation for those who wish to endure beyond the reach of their own limited sight.